Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to The Matrix, Conversations and Transformations, and we're in our third season of the seminar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice in Los Angeles. I'm Malik Moazzam Dolat, and I am joined by one of the co-organizers of The Matrix, Professor Mary Christianakis, as well as the organizer of this amazing ballroom series, CTSJ Professor Claire Crawford. Today, we're very excited to be joined by artist, activist, archivist, TV producer, Sydney Baloue. And before Professor Crawford introduces us, a quick overview of The Matrix and what's still coming up, because there's still a little bit coming up this season. The Matrix focuses on pressing current events, and our goal is to connect our community with innovative experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists in the areas of critical theory and social justice. Next Thursday, April 15th at noon, we're going to host a panel on combating anti-Asian, anti-AAPI hate crimes and violence. And our guests will be Jen Fang, who's the founder, editor, and primary blogger of one of the original blogs in this space, reappropriate.co. Professor Jane Hong of Occidental College's History Department, who recently wrote a book called Opening the Gates to Asia. Christina Wong, who's a performance artist, comedian, writer, and an elected representative in Los Angeles. And Dr. Yanyan Zhu, who recently published a text called Lotus Blossom or Dragon Lady, a content analysis of Asian women online pornography. We will have possibly one more episode, which we'll let everyone know about. But we'll be back in with a fourth season in the fall with new themes, including one called Political Imagination. So one last thing. We're using the Q&A format for the webinar. So if you have a question, just click on that Q&A button in the bottom right corner, write it up, and we'll get to it at the end. With that, I turn it over to Professor Crawford.
Thank you. Glad to introduce our guest for today's Matrix. Sydney Baloue is a writer, producer, performer, and archivist who conducts oral histories of New York City's ballroom scene. He currently works as co-executive producer and writer on HBOMax's Ballroom competition reality series, Legendary, and his writing has been featured in the New York Times, Vice, and Them. He made history as the first transgender man to win a voguing category at the Latex Ball in 2019. He's a proud member of the House of Xtravaganza. He is currently working on a book on the history and evolution of New York City's ballroom scene. In 2020, he was listed in Condé Nast Now list on Them as a Black and South Asian transgender man with roots in Trinidad and Tobago and Chicago. Sydney is grateful for his global experiences as they give greater dimension to his worldview. After completing a DAAD Fellowship in Berlin and a dual degree master's at the Paris Institute for Political Studies and the London School of Economics, Sydney left his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in 2018 to work in film and television as a way to share stories and connect people across continents, cultures, and time. As someone rooted in the diaspora and interested in transversing its intersecting lines, Sydney is excited to find and foster compelling narratives which give space for the beauty and complexity of different life perspectives. A voracious traveler who is fluent in French and speaks German, writing is the through line of all of his work. So thank you, Sydney, for joining us today. And just kind of like first getting started here, give us more about you, yourself, and how you get to ballroom.
Oh my, that was quite an intro. Thank you so much, first of all. Like, oh, who's that person? Yeah, no, thank you all for having me. This is such an incredible series. Honestly, just speaking with you, Claire, about it and just seeing all the work that y'all do. I think this is just such a great opportunity. For me, my journey in the ballroom scene actually started in Europe, which is so unexpected because when people think about ballroom, they're obviously thinking about the United States. And I was living in Berlin on this fellowship that you mentioned, the DAAD, and I used to work in public policy. And I was kind of, I describe it like Flashdance. I was welding policy by day and voguing by night. So I had this German non-binary pole dancing roommate and we were talking about Paris is Burning. And we were, quoting the film, like I think every queer person on this planet. And then when we were kikiing about that, they were like, you could take a voguing class here. And I was like, what? I'm in the whitest place on earth. What the hell is voguing doing here? And sure enough, is this woman, Georgina at the time, she's a dancer choreographer who is an Afro-German woman, cis woman. who, like many dancers around the world, save up their coins. They go to New York City for a couple months in the summertime, take a bunch of dance classes, Broadway Dance Center, Paradance, wherever. And then oftentimes they like fall into the ballroom scene, whether it's they go to Vogue nights, which was like a regular Vogue night that used to happen in New York, or even take a class from somebody in the ballroom scene who's teaching voguing. And oftentimes what happens is people like fall in love with ballroom and they're like, I want to bring this back to my hometown. And then they go back to wherever they're from and start hosting classes and inviting people from the New York scene to come and teach, hosting balls, so on and so forth. And so when you look at ballroom around the world, this has happened like so many times. There's a scene in like every corner of this planet, in Chile, in South Africa, in Korea, there's even a scene in India I heard about, and definitely all throughout Europe. And so with Georgina, she did that and really wanted to start a scene in Berlin and Dusseldorf, which is where she was originally from. And so I took her class and I loved it. I remember I really wanted to learn how to do all the feminine cool stuff you see, the spins and dips and the hair whips. And she did like a class where she went through quite a few different categories, like runway. And I remember she did like an old way version section, which with old way, there's different styles of doing this kind of dance form, which is the original style of voguing. So, geometric poses and shapes. And she was like, you're really good at the masculine stuff. And I was like, yeah, that's why I'm in the class, because I'm trying to learn how not to do that. I was like this cute little butch, and I was trying to just expand my vocabulary of like gender movement. And I was like, okay. And sure enough, she did a huge festival of where she threw this ball. It was called like Berlin Voguing Out. I did another old way workshop, loved it. And then I walked a ball in Dusseldorf, and it was like a runway category. I had champagne that night, so I was feeling it. And I won grand prize, and I was like, oh my God. And then at that point, I knew I was moving to Paris to do my master's at Sciences Po, which is the school you mentioned. And I met Lysandra Ninja. So she's like the mother of the ballroom scene in Paris. She's been featured in like everything. Vice did a thing about the ballroom scene there, and she's like one of the major figures. And I remember meeting her, and she, because she stormed the ball, she made everybody gag. And I was like, oh, I'm moving to Paris soon. And she was like, oh, baby, tell me when you're in Paris, I'll introduce you to the girls, and, we'll, just let me know. And I was like, okay. So, when I got to Paris, I hit her up, and boom, I was like in the scene. And Paris, as far as Europe is concerned, is kind of like the hub of ballroom right now. It's, there's so many balls, the kids are so into it. And in Paris, everything is Paris. It's it's Paris, darling. Like, because they book these gorgeous venues that you would just, it's just mind blowing, like chandeliers and everything. So yeah, I just got deeper into the scene, moved to London because I had to do the second part of my degree. And then it was there where my research kind of, I feel like my worlds collided, because I was like basically doing this urban planning degree, basically learning how to be a city planner. And then I was like kind of this club kid on the side. And like, I used to have a club night in East London with a good friend of mine who was from the ballroom scene. We'd throw balls, we'd DJ. And I got invited to speak on a panel about Paris is Burning at Goldsmiths. And it was actually Sarah Ahmed. She was doing like a whole class on queer, I think it was like queer cinema or something. And I remember before the class, I was like, oh my God, I should prep for this. At the time, I was in a house. I was actually, before I became Extravaganza, I was in the House of Omni, which is like one of the old school ballroom houses based in New York. And I hit up the father of my house at the time, Kevin Omni. And I was like, I just wanted to prep just in case somebody throws a curveball at this panel. And Kevin and I, we talked for like 3 hours, and he was telling me stuff that I'd never read before, I'd never seen before. And I was like, oh my God, who was writing this down? And I remember I was thinking about what to do for my master's thesis. And at the time I was like, because I was coming from this public policy background where I worked in environmental policy, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll do like an eco-justice report on New York post Hurricane Sandy. I don't know. And then I was like, you know what, if I go to New York for field research, I just want to vogue. Let me just cut the bull right here and just figure out how to vogue. So I told my advisor at the time, hey, like, you know, I had this interesting conversation, you know, about ballroom, et cetera, and it's just been eating away at me. And he was like, well, you know, this is great. In the UK, the urban planning department is in the environmental and geography department. He's like, just tie to geography in some way. I don't know the literature, but I know it's out there. You can make it work. And so what I ended up doing was I wrote this thesis on, I looked at how the geography of New York City affected the history and evolution of the ballroom scene. And so what I did were a series of oral histories where I asked senior members of the community, icons, pioneers, legends, take me to a part of New York City you think is most relevant to the history of ballroom and tell me about your history within the space. And so depending on your era of prominence, we went to like a different part of the city. So if you're like old school, somebody like Kevin Omni, who's been in the scene since the 70s, it was all about Harlem. You know, we went, I remember going uptown, he's telling me about all these venues, all these things that used to be there. But then if you're like maybe, you know, a little younger, let's say maybe in your like 50s or you know, 40s, it's all the downtown scenes. Washington Square Park, Christopher Street, the Pier, you know, all of that area. And so, you know, I did these interviews, I finished it up, and then I was like, gosh, I don't know, you know, I wrote the thesis, I ended up writing about the importance of nightclubs because people think, you know, nightclubs really were just, I mean, especially in New York, you know, iconic places, Danceteria, the Tunnel, you know, Paradise Garage, all these places, they serve a purpose that's bigger than just partying. You know, that's a place, if you're homeless, nightclubs are open 24/7. If you know, need to find family members, if you want to get a job, that's how Jose got booked by Madonna. It was, he met her at Sound Factory. And so, you know, it's just, there's a lot of things that I think sometimes you think something is one way, but actually it obviously, I mean, especially queer spaces are another. So after that, I was like, okay, back to the US. I was like trying to figure out what to do next, applied for PhD programs, got into the Africana Studies program at Penn. Did a year. It was not, I'll put it lightly, it was just not a good space. And I was like, I like to write work that is accessible to people. And I also have to be able to be myself as a trans person. And so I was like, moved back to New York and really was like working on how to write this piece or write, you know, continue my work. And I knew I wanted to do a trade book. So yeah, one thing led to another. And I just started writing for the New York Times and for other publications. And yeah, and then through that, that's kind of how I got picked up on Legendary was the showrunners. They were, you know, basically looking for a writer for the show because they're like, ballroom is such a complex world. It's easier for us to train somebody who is a writer from the community about how to write for unscripted TV rather than the other way around. And so, you know, next thing I know, I'm like in a room with Jamila Jamil and Megan Thee Stallion and just trying to like figure out how to explain this, you know, this world, this thing that I do for fun, right? That is now like part of my life's work. So, yeah.
You definitely gave us a lot here to like think about. One of the first things that comes to mind is when you're talking about geography and the fact that you come to ballroom from the space of doing it in Europe. Like, how important is it for us to consider ballroom outside of like, we got like New York usually, then like LA, sometimes folks thinks about, sometimes in between. I know Marlon Bailey wrote the book about Detroit and ballroom, but really not considering it outside of the border. So like, how important is that, and what does that do for us thinking broader? First, I guess it's like my first kind of question.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much because honestly, when I look at the history of ballroom, you know, it starts, it's also like kind of this debate in the community. There's a historical debate. When is this beginning? When is the beginning? You know? Yeah. And I feel like history debates are often like that. When did something really start? You know, and obviously we can go back to the early 20th century of drag balls. I'm sure that, you know, folks have talked about that. obviously the world of female impersonation in New York in the 1950s and 60s, which is the world from which the mothers of ballroom come, like Avis Pendarvis, Paris Dupree, Pepper LaBeija, Doreen Corey, all these women who were the foundation to ballroom come from that scene. And what's interesting to me is just how ballroom proliferates. And like you see it kind of emerge, like in the US, it moves from like New York to New Jersey, it goes to Chicago, it goes to Philadelphia. But really, I think one of the most interesting turning points for ballroom history, something that I'm definitely like digging deeper into, is the emergence of YouTube and in 2004. And really 2004, I do see as like a pivotal moment where not only is it that YouTube occurs, right? Because there's already this kind of network, right, of LGBTQ folks who are circulating different cities. And obviously there's a way that our culture like moves around. But really the thing, I think the two things that happen are Vogue nights, which is this night that Jack Mizrahi and Luna Luis Ortiz Khan do, that's at Escalitas, which is like a famous, now closed bar that was for Black and Latinx folks in New York. And what ends up happening is like, not only do they do this regular night, right, but that produces content, but then it has a place to go, which is YouTube. And then from there, you see this kind of like global expansion, really the globalization of ballroom, where folks around the world are able to access it. People see clips. Also, you have the circulation of actual people moving, and so on and so forth. And I think with ballroom around the world, what I think really intrigues me about it is just how very decolonial it is in a way, specifically in Europe, because from my experience there, the folks who were in the scene are Black and brown people who are not represented in media, because I mean, we talk about media representation in the US, but in Amsterdam, there's so few Black and brown people who are in positions of power, who are in positions of visibility. The same goes with France, the same goes with the UK. There's just sort of a lack there. And so for a lot of specifically Black and brown LGBTQ people to see themselves represented, not only in like media of like YouTube, et cetera, but like to have a sense of like, I exist and I can be great because I am an artist, because I'm creative. And we know that like, that also gives us value and worth is so powerful. And I think in so many ways, especially when I was in Paris, it's like, there's a real kind of like claiming of yourself through the culture, which I always thought was kind of interesting. And in so many ways, because you see people like, speaking English is like a position of power in a lot of places around the world, right? Because it means access to education, it is a status of sorts. And then when you can speak this like New York, very ballroom vocabulary, it's like even more power, because it's like, not only do I speak English, but I have a way of speaking about myself and a way of connecting to myself, because that fiery energy that is ballroom, that is like, I don't care who you think I am, I know who I am, I live in my truth, and like, take it or leave it. Like, I feel like it comes through not only in the language and the music and the dance and like every aspect, which I just find interesting. Like when I see, stories from other places outside the US, the way people are engaging in ballroom as a way of pushing back. Like, for example, I don't know if you have seen this, but Vice, they did a piece about ballroom in New Zealand. And I was amazed at the, people, indigenous folks, and the way that ballroom was a way for them to push back against years of colonial, missionary work and religiosity, telling them that they're not worthy or whatever. And that ballroom was this way of being like, no, you're not going to tell me that. Like, that's,
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely important, because I think like, get into these conversations around ballroom and thinking about appropriation, spectacleness. And so if it leaves like these hubs, these areas of New York, like what does that look like? Is that like, sanctioned? And I know we've had guests Like Sean Milan talked about, people travel, like kind of like how you said, right? Like someone's coming back and forth, they're getting approval, they're learning it the right way, they're taking it back, then it becomes something more powerful to them in their own capacity. Something I do really want to talk about too is like your role. So I know when Michael Roberson was here, he described Ballroom as being like too centered by cisgender men and like not focusing on Black trans women the way it should as it did in the past. That's what's his opinion, right, of the space. And so you winning the voguing category as the first transgender male to do so, like what was that experience like? How was it received? I guess also thinking about that, like if you want to talk more about that night, yeah.
Yeah, at the Latex Ball. I mean, the Latex Ball, it's the Coliseum of Ballroom, literally 5,000 people at Terminal 5. It's a huge, huge venue. So it was a big deal. And I don't think I realized how big of a deal it was until afterwards, because I was just like, I just want to go do my best. And then it's like, oh, wow, okay, I sat 15 girls down, okay. But I think, yeah, Ballroom is a space, you know what? It's always been, I think when I look at the larger trajectory of Ballroom, it ebbs and flows, right? Because originally it started out with the femme queens, trans women, because there were only categories for them, right? And in the early 80s, I remember the Butch Queens wanted a category. So they created one, just one for them, okay, which is hard to imagine, right? But back then, because basically, the premise was similar to the documentary The Queen, where you have just categories for basically trans women or femme queens, and the butch queens are the people who would help them get their costumes and things together. But at some point they were begging, and so they finally got this category called butch mod face, which was where you had to be butch, you had to look like a model, and you had to have a beautiful face. And so what is amazing is thinking, wow, back then, like, finally they were able to get their one little category. And like today, it's like when people think about Ballroom, they only think about butch queens. They only think about cis, gay, bisexual men. But it wasn't always like that, which says to me, who knows what the future brings? Because if that was the past, this could be a period where things shift. And there have been shifts and changes. Like, for example, in the early 2000s, there was a scene called the WBT scene, which was cis women, butches, like butch lesbians, and trans folks, trans women, because they got sick of the butch queens and they decided to create their own scene. And like one of the big figures of that world was Dominique Jackson, who's on Pose, and many others. But again, it's like proof, like things shift and change, and it's not always how we think about history in a sort of linear way, or that the way things are now, it was always that way. So yeah, for me to win in this category, it was a big deal because for a lot of trans guys in the scene, they mainly walk realness, which is a category that's like specifically for trans men. And originally, because access to HRT and just the way we've been thinking about identities has shifted over time. So a lot of the guys who are pioneers and icons of that era, people like Sean Coleman Ebony, Shady Prada, Marquise Balenciaga, they were butches. They used to identify as butch lesbians, and there used to be a category called male illusionists, right? Which is where you were butch and you got to like pass yourself off as like a cisgendered man, right? And obviously with the times they change, and there have been some trans guys who've walked voguing categories in the past, but not very many. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that. I think, I don't know, it's hard because I can't like speak for other people. I think what's different for me, I could speak from my experience, was I started out in Europe where the emphasis was on performance. It was on voguing because, as I mentioned, like with Georgina, she was a dancer choreographer. And there's so many dancer choreographers who go and they bring the culture back. And usually the part they're bringing back is the dance aspect, is voguing. So for me, that was what attracted me to the community. Whereas I think, especially in the US, for a lot of folks who are around ballroom culture, like realness is like, okay, there's a space that's specifically for you because the category is trans man realness. So you're like, okay, I have a lane. Whereas for me, I was always just interested in voguing, and I was like, that's my lane. Like, that's the thing I want to do. And yeah, and I did it. And I think it was for people, you know, a big deal. Because I will say, when I won in the final battle, I took my shirt off because I wanted people to see my scars, because I pass as cis, and I didn't want people to think, oh, it's some butch queen, okay, who we've never heard of. And I was like, no, 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 darling, like a trans guy. And it was, yeah, so it was a very, very powerful moment. And I think, I don't know, it's weird because Ballroom is my community. And so I know all these people, you know, it's also like, yeah, I think, yeah, it's the beginning of so many things, I think, for me, which is kind of how I saw that. And obviously making a space beyond myself. Obviously, it's, you know, voguing means a lot to me, but I'm also thinking about who's coming afterwards.
And just for the audience, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and also to my colleagues as well. But definitely just want to continue on here. So you're co-executive producer of Legendary, which I guess in a lot of ways looks like the first, like, most legit ballroom reality competition show. Shyamalan said something interesting at the last Matrix, where he's like, all of reality TV basically copies ballroom, right? Like the idea of a panel in some capacity. Like, even I think when I spoke with him one-on-one, he was talking about America's Next Top Model. Like, that was 100% like a ballroom. So I was like, you know what? I never thought about that. And so just like considering these things. So like, what is it about writing? Like, how are you writing in this like sense of authenticity, right? So Paris is Burning, loved, but also like heavily critiqued, right? For like who does it, what it makes a spectacle of, like how it's just kind of like you left folks hanging in their time of need. And you know, Jenny Livingston, though, continues on with her career, right? And folks are going through pain, like this like pain, but also beauty of ballroom space, that complexity of being like Black and brown and queer in spaces. So what are you hoping, like with Legendary, as you're writing and you're thinking about this, like what is the vision that, and also like what do you want audiences to experience when watching it?
Yeah, I think there's so many good nuggets in there, because I think one, you know, I remember when I was first doing this oral histories research, I remember I mentioned to Kevin, because I got really obsessed with Thomas DeFrance at Duke, because he had this, there was this video that he did that went viral. You know, he's a professor of African American studies who focused on Black dance, and it was about Black social dance and how basically these three moves, like all of our cool dance crazes, from the Dougie to the, you know, I don't know, the Kid and Play or whatever, can kind of be traced back to like 19th century Black social dance. And I remember I emailed him because I was like, I don't see voguing in here. and I was like, where does that fit? And he was actually like, well, you know, you should look at the cakewalk. The cakewalk is actually a better representation of, like, that's, you know, where that comes from. And so when I looked deeper into that, I was like, oh, okay, I could see that, of like, you know, with the history of the cakewalk, right, of on plantations, that one day out of the year where slaves and their masters would switch clothes, and whoever could do the best presentation, right, would win this piece of cake or whatever. And I remember I mentioned this to Kevin Omni. We were talking. I was like, oh yeah, because like, does it, you know, voguing come from the cakewalk? And he was like, well, what about let them eat cake? And I was like, oh, what do you mean? He was like, well, you know, like Marie Antoinette and a court. And then I was like, oh, I see what he's saying, where it's like ballroom, you know, and I think this gets to what is Black culture in America, right? Is that it's obviously a fusion of African traditions with Western European traditions all mixed up. And one of the things that I always think about is how ballroom borrows that idea of a court and a jester, which, to be honest, is the basis of a lot of TV shows. I wouldn't say it's necessarily unique to ballroom. I would say ballroom is like one of the many threads of that. But yeah, of course, American Idol, all these things, we have a judge where it's a tenor chop. You know, they do it in their own way, whether we see it or it's an X. I think it's, you know, we have our own method of kind of doing that, which comes from our own sort of tradition of judgment. As I said, these, you know, femme queens, the way they would like score each other and decide, we see that sort of filtered out. I think I was trying to remember the second part of your question about where ballroom fits. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, just like thinking about where Ballroom fits in the reality TV show making, like what do you want audiences to get out of a legendary when they're watching it, experiencing it, looking at it?
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so many parts, and it's interesting when you're in the room making decisions, because I think that's the thing that kind of blows my mind about this job is we're literally shaping how the world, will perceive this culture. And there's, like 40 million subscribers to HBOMax as of like January, which says, okay, this could go so many places, and that's only in the US alone. So like, who knows with distribution deals if Legendary ends up on another platform in whatever other country. So it's interesting because I almost feel like there's so much with Ballroom. There's like levels, and for me, it's always been, what is the through line, right? Like, because you do have to craft story in a way, or craft the show in a way that's digestible, right? But that is also transparent in a certain way. And in some ways, it's like slightly different to Ballroom, because in Ballroom, there's like an understanding of like, okay, you read the flyer, this is the category, you got to execute these things, right? I mean, you saw it in Paris is Burning. If the buttons are on the wrong side of the coat, darling, no, right? And there's like a way you have to do that in TV, so it's clear. Okay, well, why did Jamila say that? Why did Law go that way? And like, I think there's like a bit of that, but I think what's also crucial is kind of like giving people like bite-sized pieces, because you also have a bigger audience, right? And we can't assume that people know what things are, but then you also have to balance that with a certain level of authenticity, right? Because you can't just have, I feel like there's something, how do I want to say this? Yeah, there's certain elements of Ballroom. It's almost like kind of distilling. You're like trying to figure out like, okay, what is this? What is the secret sauce part of this thing that we all love that's so tangy? Like, okay, how can we give that to people? And I think, yeah, it definitely comes down to like paring things down a little bit, making it clear. Even though in some aspects the messiness of Ballroom is part of the magic, I think. Right? So it's like, it's kind of hard. It's like, okay, we can have messy, but not too messy, where we're like, what is going on? It's like, I think it's that. And then obviously too, I think what's different is you have so many chains of command, because there's the production company, there's HBOMax, right? And like, they also have to be able to track the show, which means you'll get notes from the network that says, hey, what do will people be confused if we say Chopped? Are they going to think about a cooking show? Like, literally, there's like questions like that, which I know we would have, some people be like, really? But then you got to think like, yeah, this is like middle America. These are people who have never been to a club or to a whatever, a ball. And I think there's a beauty also in doing a little bit of that hand holding and, just kind of introducing people to something new. The way that I've always looked at Ballroom, honestly, to me, Ballroom is like jazz. It's like jazz culture. And because I think in so many ways, it's like jazz, it's like hip hop. These are, Black social, cultural, movements really that emerge, especially, or like take root in New York, I think. And they have this, they're so infectious. And there's a reason they're infectious. And it's because of the authenticity, it's because of the virtuosity of the movement, of the music, of truly an ethos, right? Because like Ballroom is, to me, it's an ethos. And I think it's really cool to be able to share that with others.
Should we introduce a couple of questions from the audience? Okay, so the first question is from one of our students. Because this is going on YouTube, we'll leave that out unless our student insists. How do you view the queer diaspora operating within Ballroom? Or how does Ballroom provide a sanctuary space within the diaspora?
Within the queer diaspora, okay, so I mean, I guess because Ballroom is a touchstone for so many people, right? Because it is a site of, it's truly resistance, right? If the world is telling you you're not worthy, you're not this, it's like literally like, I don't care what you think, because I think ballroom operates in its own little world. Like I actually view it as a culture unto itself. Like I don't even necessarily consider it queer culture. I think that yes, it overlaps with being LGBTQ and Black, but it's truly its own world. I think the idea of sanctuary, it's interesting because I'm of the opinion there are no real safe spaces. You know, I know that everyone's having this conversation about safe spaces. How do we make this? It's like you can have some spaces that are safer than others, but I don't think. I think ballroom. I've always seen it as a world of competitive artists and artistic competition. And when you're in a competitive environment, watch out. Okay, you know, like you got people who want to win. At the bottom line, that's sort of what forms the basis of it. Obviously, the apparatus around that is family, is chosen family, is, you know, just like a variety of things, your friends, this community of sorts. But yeah, I think as a sanctuary, it's a sanctuary for art. Maybe is how I see it. An incubation space with ideas of just like incredible creativity in that way.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more, and I know you've talked about it, but just a little bit more about your experience, particularly in Paris. I've always been interested in the racial politics in Paris around the sort of the colonial Algerian experience and other Black people in Paris. And I was wondering if you could say something about how ballroom, how that shows up in ballroom.
You know, especially because I saw they just banned the hijab, which I'm just like, Jesus. Ugh. I mean, yeah, I think with ballroom, I mean, there's so many friends. Actually, there's somebody, I feel like the person you should check out, one of my good friends, Ari DB, AKA Habibi Bitch. They're amazing. They're a non-binary French Algerian queer activist who's also like part of the ballroom scene. And I think actually Vice did a recent documentary about ballroom. I'll see if I could like find the title and I'll send it to you. But about sort of like the ballroom scene right now. I think for a lot of people, again, it's like a place of having your voice heard. And there's so many people like who are part of not only nightlife, but they even like did a whole performance at the Elysee Palace. I think it was like 2 years ago. Kitty Smile, he's a really big DJ producer who's part of the ballroom scene, who, you know, has really created a space for folks to express themselves. And I think with ballroom, it really has opened the door for people to see, I don't know, like to see what their abilities are. Because I think in France, you know, so much of the culture it is a boys' club. It is very, you know, bourgeois as far as like who has access to power. In power even, and especially in culture, right? Capital C culture, which I think obviously France cashes in on with their museums, with the whole, you know, tourist apparatus. So I think for people to be able to have a space where they can express themselves freely and like be themselves. And also like truly there's an entrepreneurial aspect to it because so many of the people from the ballroom scene are being booked as dancers, are, you know, doing artistic practices in museums, are doing so many things. And I think ballroom has offered an avenue for that. And in so many ways, I see it really similar to like hip hop culture, where I think hip hop culture, I know in France has a unique history as well, which again, open up avenues for so many people. And I feel like the LGBTQ POC version of that is what ballroom is today.
Do we want to hit the second question? Because I think the person needs, you know, it's so how can we find out if there's a ballroom community near us? I'm asking from the San Francisco Bay Area.
Yeah, well, there definitely is a ballroom scene in Oakland and San Francisco. I know there's some folks out there. I know, I'm trying to think of like who, Ryan from the House of Amore. There's like, I think of, because I spent some time there. I know there's folks who teach classes like Jacques Whitfield, who's at like, I think it's Dance Center, I forget, somewhere in the city, like Mission Dance Center. I know there's folks who throw balls in Oakland. I know there's like a couple of ninjas and other houses out there. Honestly, I think a lot of ballroom exists online. You know, it's you find somebody on Instagram who you follow, and then oh, you see a flyer on Facebook, there's like different Facebook groups. It's kind of interesting how that whole world, this world of literally paper flyers in New York, is now like a whole world on Facebook, particularly. So, yeah.
I'm wondering if we could go back to the topic of your show. You're a co-executive producer. What are you hoping that your audiences experience, and what do you think about the shows that take on ballroom narratives or culture, and whether Pose and RuPaul's Drag Race or the Real Housewives series? What do you think about that in relation to your goals and your?
Yeah, I think with Ballroom, it's such an interesting space because, like, as I said, the culture is infectious. And I think I was thinking a lot about, I remember I kind of Googled this once of like, why are Black people cool? I was wondering, just like, why? And then I think this article kind of popped up about concepts of like, what does it mean to be cool, right? And like things like, specifically, I think about this concept of a itutu that popped up. I don't know if you're familiar, but itutu is this like Yoruba sort of concept of when there's chaos, right? And you're like a leader of a village, like you don't want to show that you are freaking out. You want to show that you have things under control. So you want to have this like cool, calm demeanor, even in moments of stress. And so like when you see like masks of this like, 800 AD of these like Yoruba leaders or whatever, it'll always be this kind of like cool, calm face. And this article like went on to talk about how like Miles Davis, right, the birth of the cool, this idea of like chilling out and like, I'm going to play all these really cool notes and phrases, but I'm not going to look like I'm stressed, And I think that's what's also at the heart of voguing is like you do these incredible spins and dips and you make it look effortless, because the key is that you show your virtuosity, your creativity, your authenticity, your individual self, and you are so in tune and in touch with yourself that you are unbothered by anything else. And I think that there's like a beauty and a comfort in like, seeing somebody who can get to that level of presence and of being where they're just, they are unbothered by the rest of the world. And I think that's a touchstone for so many people. I also think that there's this kind of like insider outsider thing, which I feel like always pops up in American history of wanting to be in with the cool kids, right? And that means like, the appropriation of language, of culture, the fact that everyone's throwing shade. I mean, I remember watching like, I forget, like Good Morning America and being like, wow, this is where we're at, like, but it's also, I don't know, to me, that's like African-American culture, right? Like there's always bits and pieces that kind of end up, I mean, when bling bling was, I don't know, it was like Oxford Dictionary, that was like such a big moment, but it was also a moment where you see how Black culture influences broadly American culture, but I mean, just the English language in general. I think, with RuPaul, I mean, power to her, because she understands the format and the concept. And to her credit, she's from the downtown scene in New York. She was there in the 80s. She sat on panels. She knows the deal, and she understood, hey, this is infectious, and it's a great way of like, exploring a topic or really pushing drag further. And I mean, drag is the kissing cousin of ballroom. It's where ballroom comes from. So, I'm not going to be like, oh, how dare she? It's like, well, she saw an opportunity and she took it, and there's so many ways that overlaps. I just think that really, it just shows how, I feel like this always happens where things that are underground become mainstream in a certain way. And I think there's a tendency to always bemoan like, it's almost like that Portlandia episode, it's totally over, right? Like, it's like, oh, now this person's in it, I guess, but I almost feel like that's inevitable. And with ballroom, nothing is really over, because ballroom is just so inventive. I think that's the thing that kind of blows me away. And I don't know if that I don't know, part of me feels like that's kind of like the way New York is that things shift and move so quickly that it's like, okay, everyone's throwing shade. Now everybody's, you know, doing something else. There's always like a new thing. And even, you know, when you look at, let's say, just the dance aspect of ballroom, voguing as a concept has shifted dramatically over time. When you're watching Paris is Burning, the way people are moving their bodies, right, is so different from what you see on YouTube today, right? And a lot of that evolution has to do with the way music changes over the time. I mean, one thing that I know as a DJ in the scene is like, you know, you go from a disco funk, Paradise Garage era of New York City to, you know, you pass through so many time periods, so many things that happen, how the way house music changes, the way it gets faster, right? The way, you know, how is your body going to move when you know, the beat is faster. Also, you get the addition of new people in the community, and movement and things like that changes. I also personally think, you know, when you think about voguing, literally the word is you're taking a picture like you're in Vogue magazine. That comes from an analog world, right? Like if you have to stop for the picture, right? You can't keep moving like crazy because we all know, like, or, you know, for folks who've never used an analog camera, you know, you got to stop for the picture, otherwise it's not a good picture, right? And like that logic is so different from the way people move today. And I actually feel like there's an argument to be made about the way even the technology has shifted and the way that we look at movement and dance performance, because we're all about video. Like you could take, you know, a blast with your phone of like 1,000 pictures in like however many seconds, right? Which says that, you know, you can be doing so many other things, right, that have to do with the way your body moves. And I even think about the way people think about their bodies in those spaces, right? Where it's like, you know, today we're so used to things being quick, things moving, right? TikTok videos, boom, 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 versus like taking your time and stopping for the picture, which I think just, yeah, maybe also has to do with temporalities and other things like that too.
Yeah, there's something about both the press of time and the changing technologies and representations, but also I think with, you know, with respect to how people are talking about RuPaul's Drag Race as being authentic or not. Can you say a little bit more about that, or appropriations or stuff like that?
Right. Yeah. And I think, yes, there, you know, there are certain things, it's almost like playing telephone, I think sometimes, right? Because I know like people in the community, for example, like, okay, when you see somebody who's voguing, you know, slam their back, and ideally they shouldn't be slamming their backs, but, you know, head to the ground, like we call that a dip, right? Because originally voguing used to be called pop, dip, and spin. Like, and because the idea was you had to pop your joints, you had to go into a dip, right, which is go to the floor, and you had to spin at some point. So we always called it a dip. But then somehow, I think through RuPaul, it became known as a shablam. And the shablam comes from actually this guy, Mystery Dior, who is one of the pioneers of dramatics performance, which is kind of like the very, you know, like high energy movement of voguing. And because on the mic, he used to say, when you're voguing femme, 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 just to get your 10, 10, 10s, you're the creme de la creme, creme, creme. I want you to stop, shawam. And so originally it was shawam, but then somehow, boop, 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 this gets to be known as shablam. So I think there are things like that, which to me is like one of those things where people want footnotes. We want footnotes for language, you know? We're like, I wish you cited that. I wish you, you know? And I don't know, it's weird. It's like, language doesn't work like that, right?
There's a dialogue going on, right? It's more dynamic than that.
Right. And, you know, and I think, yes, I mean, when it comes to authenticity, because that's what I'm saying. I feel like their drag, especially the world of drag that RuPaul is part of, these are like kissing cousins. They're not like the same, right? But there's like areas of overlap. And, you know, I think it also probably speaks to how ballroom is a very Black, very Latinx world. And it's almost like a discussion more broadly about like, where do Black and Latinx LGBTQ people fit in the larger scheme of LGBTQ plus culture? Because RuPaul not only, I wouldn't say skews more white, because I think like, she appeals to everybody. And that to me has always been the space of female impersonation, is there for, there are just so many historically people who like pass through those walls. But I think, yeah, some people see it like, oh, like, who is your audience? Who are you speaking to? And yeah, where are you pulling from? And I think there's always been that feeling of like, okay, the white queens are, usually that's like the progression of culture is like a Black trans woman who said something, and then a Black gay queen, and then this person, that person, and somehow now it ends up on, Good Morning America, that kind of thing. But it speaks to like, again, how either underground culture becomes mainstream, I think, really, is like, how does culture pass through different hands? And yeah, I guess to the question of like authenticity, I mean, yeah, I guess they're authentic to their world. And that might mean different things to different people. But yeah, to me, it just, I don't know, it seems like it's a conversation, it's a dialogue, because also RuPaul has created a interesting and unique platform. I mean, who knew this is the place where drag would go, right? Because I think drag has seemed to be very local, right? It was like a kind of local thing. Every city had their person, and especially like New York as its own little world, right? So that question of, obviously they dealt with the questions we're dealing with now. It's just like, how do you adapt this world for a larger stage, right? What does that look like? What are the, bits and pieces that fit in there? And yeah, I don't know. I kind of see it as like, yeah, these things kind of like going in and out of each other. There's always these moments where, I don't know, especially that question of authenticity. It's funny because I think like hip hop, they deal with that all the time too, right? Of like, who gets to say and do what? Oh, there's a new white rapper on the scene. What does that mean? It's just like, I don't know. I feel like we're always having this conversation, just in different spaces. I sorry to keep going back to jazz, but I think about like, when I read Miles Davis's autobiography, I remember he was complaining about Downbeat magazine, like saying that the best, jazz artist, like that, I think they said like one of the best saxophonists was like Paul Desmond and not John Coltrane, right? And reading that, I was like, oh yeah, I know, I know how that game goes. We're like, who gets to claim the culture? Who gets to be part of this? Also, who gets to decide what's the best, right? Like, I think that idea of judgment of who, who's giving out the awards, who's saying what's what, like, I don't know. I think that's always kind of been in the ether whenever you get to these places. And to be fair, there are some people who might even watch Legendary from the bottom, so you'd be like, why, why does even somebody like Naomi or somebody like Deshawn, who have tons of credentials, there's always going to be a critic. I think that's how I see it. There's always somebody who, who's questioning.
Thank you.
Malik, did you want to ask a question? Okay. Yeah, no. So like, as we're like wrapping up here, I did want to get to your piece that you wrote, voguing for our lives again in the New York Times. So thinking about movement and I guess voguing as a movement, but then also like living as just like a consistent movement as Black folks. So how do we do better or be more informed about first the lives of Black trans folks, but then also centering them in our movement actions and justice or concepts of justice, because that's always one of those things I feel like is ebbs and flows as well. So you want to speak more about that piece and then like how we can center Black trans folks better in our movement work?
Yeah, I think because basically I was doing this artist residency with the Laundromat Project in New York. And obviously when COVID hit, I had these huge plans of doing tons of oral histories interviews, sitting down with folks and, really having these like intimate moments. And then, we're all shut down for quarantine. And I remember just like kind of having a moment of pause, I think like so many of us, and trying to figure out, okay, what to do next, you know, where do we go from here? And also because I'm looking at history in a larger sense, and I am very interested in documenting that history. And really, you know, for me, the urgency is that so many people in our community sometimes pass away unexpectedly. And it will be just so devastating, but it's also just like, you know, the product of intersectional oppression. When you're Black, trans, gay, you know, just all of these things come together. And I remember talking to one of my cohort members who said, you know, instead of looking at like the large, heavy picture of history, why don't you look at like this moment? Because this is a historical moment and you're in it. And why don't you document what's happening now? And when she said that, I was like, oh my God, you're right. And especially because the thing that was getting me through COVID really were the hilarious memes, people voguing on TikTok or Instagram, you know, I just saw the way my community was adapting, which to be honest is what we always do in the scene. You know, it's like there's an AIDS pandemic happening in the 80s. Well, we will continue to thrive. We will be in these spaces. Even when I had interviewed people, I remember, you know, talking to people of different eras in ballroom, like especially the Giuliani years of just things being, you know, clubs being shut down, just gentrification taking hold, there were still ways that ballroom found a space, right? And it was like, we used to go to the clubhouse, or we used to go to the YMCA in Brooklyn. There were just, you know, always ways that we still existed, we still showed up. So with the pandemic, I saw the same thing, and it was digitally. It was like, okay, we can't have a ball in person, we're gonna do one on Zoom. And I remember just being like, wow. And I thought I was sick of Zoom. And there's a ball on Zoom, okay, I can get down with, you know, like, that's what I'm saying, like, you know, the way we appropriate tools, right? I think when people think about Zoom, they're like another meeting, but they're like, if you knew there was a ball happening on Zoom, you might think about Zoom differently. And so, you know, just seeing that, I was like, yeah, we should talk about this. And I also saw so many parallels, right? Because I think like in the early days of the pandemic, we were thinking about, you know, what does it mean to be in this moment where people are scared? There's a virus going around that's deadly, that we don't have a lot of information about. I remember talking to elders in the community about their thoughts about that. And again, you saw so many parallels, the way that Asian Americans have been scapegoated. There's so many parallels to the way that the LGBTQ community was scapegoated at the height of the AIDS epidemic, and just sort of the residuals of that. And I remember one of the elders telling me about that, because at the time, you know, there was just so much Asian American or violence against the Asian American community. And yeah, so I just saw that as, you know what, this is an important moment to document, to think about, to talk about. And then at the same time, boom, this is when the protests were really at their peak. And, you know, we're talking about Black trans lives, and just really, I feel like the conversation really shifted even more, because then I saw people outdoors voguing at protests and really speaking out. And again, this goes back to voguing as a form of protest. It's not only like a form of, I don't know, because like voguing, I feel like it can be so many different things, you know, because it's about artistry, it's about creativity, but also sometimes when words are not enough, really, I think it like voguing just says so much. There's so many balls where, I mean, I know I've had mine where it's like I'm having either a rough day or something, and it's just like, you just got to get it out, you know, and it's not, I don't know. The way that I see it, honestly, is like, as a Black person in this world, as a Black and brown person, like, dance isn't this separate thing from our lives. It's like integral, you know, it's like part of how you know, it's almost like water, like you just need it. And it's a form of expression, it's a form of conversation. Like, you know, a battle is not only a battle, it's a conversation, you know, it's a way of building community and so many things. So to see folks also voguing as a way of letting out emotion, their frustration, but also showing power, because there were so many people voguing down in front of cop cars, which to me was just, it's huge because it says like, yeah, you think you're powerful, here's my power. You'll never take that away from me also, you know? And I think that is something that Ballroom gives you because, I don't know, you know that you walk in the footsteps of so many people who fought so many battles before you. That is just like ingrained, I think, in your mind. And I know for me personally, in my experience in New York, knowing all the people who fought those battles, you know, the fact that you pass, I remember when I was interviewing Jose Extravaganza, my house father, I remember we passed Stonewall around Christopher Street going down the pier. And he told me, you know, Angie Extravaganza used to tell him about, you know, this is where the girls fought back, right? And even though that wasn't her era, it's just like it's something you know, it's something that's a touchstone to you. And I think that's how I view even all of these other ballroom artifacts. Even, you know, as you mentioned with Paris is Burning, it is a snapshot of time. And I think part of its potency is we are not represented in the history books. And that is a recollection of like, not only did you exist in the past, but you were powerful, you're beautiful. And that also says that you can exist in the future, right? Because I think that's really sort of, history is never really a reflection of the past. It's also a reflection of our present. And in many ways, I think it can also reflect the future in that way. So with documenting all of this, I just saw the importance of really, you know, writing that down and thinking about, you know, how, especially my generation of ballroom will be thinking about ballroom in the future. Because I think for us, we've always had to deal with grief, honestly. It's part of, you know, ballroom in a certain sense of like, you think about the people who've passed. Unfortunately, Black trans women are also still being murdered today. That is like huge epidemic. Black trans men, our lives are also at stake. And yeah, and I think we have always found ways to navigate, to come together, to, you know, think more broadly. And I don't know, we're often at the vanguard of that. So yeah, it was truly an honor to be able to like help share those stories, to think more broadly about that, and also to share that with the world, because I think that's kind of how I've seen this space that I occupy, where I kind of like have my fingers in multiple pots, but to be able to, you know, sort of open that space to show like, no, you know, our thoughts about the world, our viewpoint as artists, as creators, as, you know, incredible and phenomenal people is equally as important as anybody else. And yeah, should hear about it.
Thank you so much. The hour's flown by. The hour's over.
Oh no, I talk too much.
No, it's amazing. Thank you so much for that. You have social media. You're on Twitter. Do you want to tell us what your Twitter handle is so
Yeah,
people can find you?
Yeah, folks can find me Twitter or Instagram. I'm at Sydney, Sydney, Baloue, Baloue. Yeah, feel free to hit me up. Tweet at me. I'll chat with you back.
Okay, that's amazing. Thank you so much for the time, Professor Crawford.
No, thank you so much for wrapping up our series. I think you left us with something to think about, right? Like, so taking away, what is the future? It's resiliency, it's living, it's continuing to be creative, it's continuing the process of life. So thank you everyone for joining The Matrix and this final episode of the Ballroom series. Thank you, Sydney, for blessing us and taking us out on this one. Join us next week for another episode of The Matrix, and see everybody then.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Thank you again, Sydney.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me.
Okay.
All right.